So I'm going to talk about sports injuries and how they kept me sane in general practice. And the other thing is, why did I do it? And are they different? Well, the answer is yes, they are different. As you've already said, it's because people go out of their way to get themselves injured that they are different. But it's also because they're going out of their way to keep themselves fit. And therefore, as a GP, I thought that was a good thing, and I should help them to do it and help them prevent becoming injured, or when they were injured. Now, that fine-looking young person that you see there is me as captain of Edinburgh University, and as you can see, rugby has always been my passion. That is in Canada, when we were touring as Edinburgh University, and despite the early attempt at a vasectomy, I went on to have 3 fine sons. So rugby's been in my blood, and I've always adored it. But I've also adored this place, and I put in this, which we're not going to see this summer again either, are we? Is because I wouldn't have got anywhere without the help from Linlithgow Rugby Football Club, because they supported and encouraged me in the beginning, and indeed bought the first ultrasound machine for a sports injury clinic that I was involved in. And every team should have a team doctor. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? I started off being a team doctor in the early 90s when I went with the under-19 team to Romania. That is not Romania, as you can see. But we went there in 1991, which was an interesting time to visit Romania because it was just after the revolution. It was the first World Cup, and Scotland were going there as a senior squad to play against Romania in a warm-up. And many of you may recall that they actually got beaten by Romania then. How times have changed. So I then became involved with the Scottish Rugby with their under-18 team, then their under-21 team, then their B team, A team as they're now called, and eventually the senior team. This is in 1997 when I was touring South Africa, and the guys used to go and hold clinics. And this is a clinic in one of the towns. And that is Mpumalanga, which was beautiful. I toured South Africa, I toured Australia twice, and of course, New Zealand. Not only was I a team doctor, but I was Chief Medical Officer at FASIC, which is the Fitness Assessed Sports Injury Clinic at Edinburgh University. I also ran a clinic at St John's Hospital on a Friday, and for a wee while, for my sins, and I apologise, I did a private clinic at the Murrayfield Hospital. I got a World Cup out of being a team doctor, but where was my World Cup? That's Dalmahoy. That's our World Cup picture. The World Cup was in Scotland. Never left Murrayfield until I went to the final at the Millennium Stadium in 2001, which had just finished. You can see some very famous faces there. Jim Telfer at the front, Ian McGeechan. I'm just trying to see. I'm trying to see where I am actually. Well, I am somewhere there on the front row. But that's outside Dalmahoy. So that's as far as I got with my World Cup. And you'll recognise this chap here. That's Doddy. Now, what did I do, sports injuries? Well, first of all, of course, there was a pitch side. I dealt with injuries. This is Tom Smith, sorry, so not Tom Brown. And also with training injuries. In American football, 15% of their injuries are training injuries, which is absolutely ludicrous when you think about it. Why should you have nearly a fifth of your injuries, a sixth of your injuries on the painting pitch? With treatment, we had to liaise with a physiotherapist, rehabilitation, dealing and returning people to sport, and liaising with the coach and manager. When I was doing this, which is in the late 1990s, a paper came out showing who was the most important person making the decision to get a player back on the pitch, and it was a team owner. This is in football and soccer in the Premier League in England. And you can understand that. If they've paid millions of bucks to get a star player, the last thing they want is them sitting on the bench. This is in New Zealand, and this is a treatment cum massage room. It sounds very glamorous, touring, and yes, it could be, but basically it consisted of an inside of a stadium, an inside of a plane, an inside of a bus, or an inside of a hotel most of the time. And this is treatments, rubs. Every time we arrived there, we got a massage guy, and this guy is a New Zealander. This is a physio. His name's Bob Stewart, and Bob is from Troon, and Bob is a turncoat. He is now the physio for the England rugby football team. I still speak to him. It was got so busy that we had to have a timetable, and this is quiet day, believe it or not, Tuesday morning, which was probably a rest day anyway. On a Tuesday, it would be a quiet day, and you can even see that I still had to go and do house visits in a hotel. The treatment of an injury is rest and then ice. Compression, that's a horrible looking thing, isn't it? But that inflated indeed. It was a compression. It wasn't compressed all the time. It inflated and deflated, but it was to stop swelling. We occasionally had to protect the player from an injury. This is probably an illegal procedure, but we did it. What else did I have to do as a team doctor? Well, I had to be aware of the effects of illness, or for instance, an upper respiratory tract infection. But at the moment, actually, a team doctor must be very, very useful in the coronavirus for, the testing, for diagnosis, for vaccination, but more importantly, for isolation, etc., making sure. I suspect, looking at the weekend, that France were still suffering from the effects of their COVID-19 outbreak, because they looked like me that they were well off the boil and had run out of steam. Effects of chronic illness. We had guys with all sorts of things, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's. Had to have a working knowledge of exercise physiology. Nowadays, that's probably not so important. You still have to have it, but nowadays you have a physiologist with the team. In those days, we didn't. We did have a fitness guy, but he wasn't truly a physiologist. Know about their diet. Again, nowadays is not so important because there's a nutritionist with them all the time. Ergogenic aids. Now, these are the things that they take to try and improve their performance. Sadly, some of these ergogenic aids, as you probably know, are banned. And you had to know whether the guys were taking them or whether they weren't. Come on. No, it's not moving. Oh, team dynamics was very important, how the team got on. And I don't just mean the players, but I mean the whole team, including the physio, the coaches, and a working knowledge of psychology. And that's a team psychology, individual psychology, how you got to know your players. A bit like it's being a GP, effectively. You get to know your patients, you get to know the players, how they work, how they function, those who need a bollocking and those who need just the arm around the shoulder. And actually the coaches, the psychology of the coaches was trying to teach them psychology rather than working out their psychology. Some coaches, it's win at all costs. Other coaches, it was slightly different. And the psychology of competition and being in a camp for 5 or 6 weeks was interesting because the dynamic would change. The dynamic of the individual would change. The dynamic of the team would change. You would lose individuals and somebody new would come into the team. You never lost coaches, sadly, sometimes. When I first started out, it was early days of professional sport, or professional rugby, should I say. So we didn't really know what was going to happen. So audit was important as a team doctor, research and education, audit was really about the epidemiology. What sort of injuries were we getting? What's the cause of these injuries, as was the research. The education was teaching the players on how to look after themselves, what to do when they were injured. You know, in the amateur days, when you had finished a game, and this included international players, you would go off and have 10 pints. Well, that's not a good thing to do if you've got an injury, because you're standing about, you're increasing the blood flow to the injury, and therefore you're increasing the length of time it's going to take to get better. Educating team management on what an injury is and what an injury and how long an injury can be, and educating team management, and go back to the previous slide, on psychology, and the psychology of players and the psychology of everybody else and the other members of the medical team, which is an ongoing you know, CPD type thing. Records are useful because you get to understand the epidemiology, patterns of injury, and therefore prevention. Part of that was a pre-participation evaluation. This thing is to make sure that folk don't have issues with their heart. This is hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy, and is a cause of sudden death in very young men. Gabby Logan's brother died from that. And also, before pre-participation, they should have a musculoskeletal examination. Now, this guy here, I don't know if any of you guys remember a guy called Archie Leslie from Linlithgow. This is John Leslie, and he was his grandnephew. So his grandparents came from Linlithgow. Now that's not nice, is it? And epidemiology, we found that the tackle is the most common source of injury in rugby. Now that's not a good thing to know, particularly if you're a rugby administrator, because how are you going to get people allowing their kids to play in sport if tackling, something as common as tackling, is the most common source of injury? Many years ago, again in the 1990s, the SRU were involved in financing a bit of research by a lady called Alison Pollock, who's quite well known. She does a lot of work on, well, basically health protection, etc. And she had a young family, and they were involved in rugby, and they were always getting injured. And she wanted to find out about the tackle. So they started doing this research. Halfway through the research, they found that this was the commonest cause of injury was the tackle. And the SRU withdrew their finances at that stage. Funny thing that, eh? Drugs. Well, not because I was supplying them, I hastened to add that straight away, but as a team doctor, you had to know what was allowed and what the athlete is taking, prescribed or non-prescribed. The non-prescribed bit is extremely important, because I nearly got caught out on a couple of occasions. After you have told guys what is allowed and what is not allowed, they still go and take stuff that's not allowed. And the simple thing was Sudafed, which, you know, you take for most of these forwards are running around with broken noses, and they think taking Sudafed makes them breathe better. A procedure to make their nose, you know, work better would probably help, but it doesn't. But that's not what they want. So they took Sudafed. And I remember in Australia being caught out with one of the players because he'd taken Sudafed 2 days before the game, which of course is a banned substance. Fortunately, it didn't test, but he'd declared it. But if you are taking something that is, for instance, for asthma, that is some of the stuff that they take for asthma is actually illegal, i.e. if you took it non-prescribed. But if you declare it beforehand with a set of lung function tests proving that you've got asthma, then it is legal. And as long as when you're getting drug tested, you declare it, and you declare that you have declared it in a pre-participation declaration. So that's it. I need to know about the testing, about asthma. what you can take for an upper respiratory tract infection. We've already spoken about that. And diarrhea and vomiting. Again, the stuff that you take for that are banned substances. I found match days incredibly nerve-wracking. They were very tense. And they got more tense the longer I was in sports and exercise medicine. I think basically because I was getting away without some serious injury. And in fact, after I retired, the following year, one of our wingers broke his neck in Cardiff, you may recall that. And I was extremely glad I wasn't there having to deal with that. But this was the matchday medical team at Murrayfield. Now, it's significantly bigger now. Significantly bigger now, and I'll come on to that in a wee bit, why it is. There was a team doctors, i.e. me. There was 2 physiotherapists. There was a standby doctor who would deal with things like stitching folk up or taking somebody to hospital if they needed to go. Paramedics, who were very helpful for evacuating an injured player off the pitch. There was an orthopedic surgeon, and there was often an A&E specialist. And there was often, because of the nature of rugby and medics getting on with it, there was various specialists in the crowd, and we knew about that. One of the specialists was a guy called Donald MacLeod. I don't know if anybody knows him. He was a guru of sports medicine in Britain, never mind Scotland. And he is Jonathan Malloy's father-in-law. And Jonathan is, with the Reed Band. Nowadays, it's a much bigger team. When we were there, dealing with injuries, or dealing with an injury on the pitch is dead easy. Or should I say, dealing with a broken leg on the pitch is dead easy, because there's no decision, you're off. Dealing with a soft tissue injury on the pitch is much more difficult, because it might just, as they say, run it off, which is, I don't believe in that running it off, but it will improve. Or it's not going to improve. And that really depends on sometimes where you have it. A torn hamstring is an easy one as well. And the torn Achilles tendon is probably relatively straightforward. But there are these that are other ones that are a bit iffy. And one of those, of course, is a head injury. And head injuries, now I've got people in the stand, I've got doctors in the stand watching what is happening. And that is why you will have noticed that head injury assessments don't necessarily happen straight away after the head knock. They happen for a short spell afterwards. And that's why I would like to just discuss concussion. The reason being that it's become fairly high profile. And when I was doing it, it wasn't as high profile. When I was doing sports medicine, it wasn't. And indeed, when I was doing sports medicine, there was a guy doing team sport and doing rugby. There was a guy in the States, a man called Cantu, who's a very famous neurosurgeon, and he's still working, and he must be in his 80s, said that it wasn't, that each concussive episode was a single episode, and that was it, it was over and done with. We now know differently, and Cantu has recanted that as well, but it's not, and we know that through NFL, football, rugby, sadly. But it's not a new problem. It's been there for years. Rugby, I think it's fair to say, at the highest level, is combative. I was trying to get the Mohammed House, Jamie Ritchie picture, but I couldn't find it. This is Tom Young from Leicester, and I'm not sure who this guy is. But this is a sort of comment that really doesn't help. This macho image in rugby, isn't it? Good shot, mate. Go well in the final. I owe you a pint. Huh. You owe him a pint? Common assault. He owes him 10 years in jail. Rugby turned professional in 1995, and a few things have happened since then, and that's one of them. Size matters. The players have become huge. Just be grateful that nobody like that was playing against us in a day. And if you just look at this is a Welsh team. Any Welsh here? I can insult them then. But if you look, this is 2000, these are the 2000, this is within a decade, the sizes. Wingers are now, centre now in the end of the 1990s was 80 kilograms, now 107 kilograms. A winger, 1.98 and 104 kilograms. But look at the forwards, they're just massive. They're huge. So, and they're hitting you, and they're now hitting you in a, we talked about the tackle, and the tackle has changed. The tackle has changed to try and dislodge the ball. And the tackle is up here now rather than down round the ankles. And these are backs. George North here, he's a big, and this is Matthew Bastero, who must weigh 19, 20 stone. Now, I was a centre. I wouldn't want to be tackling that guy coming hurtling at me, even if I had a good tackle. And Ronan Nagaro says this now, rugby is played by athletes now. When I started, it was played by rugby players. He's right. It's now becoming less and less skillful. It's more reliant on power. It's a different game. It's not moving the ball wide. It's hit up, then move it out. He does say the two players, 9 and 10, are still the skillful ones. But concussion is a headache that refuses to go away. And I don't know how many of you remember this guy who was injured in a game for Australia. He was quite obviously knocked out, got back up, taken off the pitch, assessed, came back on again, and didn't know what he was doing. Just didn't know what he was doing. Concussion is a brain injury. That's it. That's the bottom line. It's a brain injury. It's an injury to the brain. And it can occur after any blow to the body as well as the head. Now, the brain doesn't fill the whole of your skull. There's some fluid round about your brain. So if you move your head quickly, there's a bit of sloshing that goes about. So you can imagine if you get thumped by 20 stone of Toby Falatau or somebody, and you come back down, hit the ground, you get a shuddering, and you get an inertia in the brain. The brain keeps moving, whereas the skull may have stopped. So there's always a risk that your brain's going to knock off your skull, bounce off your skull. So you don't have to be knocked out to get concussion. You just have to get a great big thump. And that can occur in any sport. In any sport. In fact, probably the commonest sport is jockeys. Jockeys are the commonest athletes are getting concussed. And I think this is an important bit. All are serious and can change an athlete's behaviour, thinking and physical functioning. And recognition and proper response is vital. This guy wrote a book about this is a guy called Bernard Jackman, who played for Leinster for many years, and he had to retire because of head injuries. And this bottom bit, honesty is vital, because players are never honest. They want to play. And the player cannot judge a situation, no reply to it. And that's again George Smith being taken off to the bin. And now we have this thing called a concussion bin, which is basically pitch side concussion assessment. And this is completely different to when I was playing, when I was the team doctor. When I was the team doctor, we made an almost instant decision on the pitch, because there was no pitch side assessment. You were either concussed or you weren't. So again, if it's one of the more important players and he's obviously concussed, your coach doesn't want them off. But I know that shouldn't influence my decision, but it sometimes did, to be honest. Nowadays, as I said, it's far better, because there's a match doctor assessing the injuries, looking at what's happened, watching that player who is moving about gingerly afterwards and not knowing what they're doing. And therefore, that's why they go off now for the head injury assessment. This over here, with a finger, seeing what they're doing, that's a waste of time. Complete nonsense. Mind you, he's a Welsh physio, what would you expect? Basic concussion, suspect, if somebody's, even somebody, you think nowadays folk are getting sent off for doing no-arm tackles. If they're hitting somebody on the head, the person that's been hit on the head should go off for a head injury assessment. Night follows day. On-field or sideline assessment, if concussion confirmed, remove, physical and cognitive rest until asymptomatic, and fully graded program of return to exercise. Post-concussion syndrome can last for anything up to 2 years. And it causes short-term memory loss. It actually causes personality change. People can become bad-tempered and violent, anxiety, depression, poor decision-making, and marriages, relationships can split up because of it. And players have had to retire because of it. And sadly, players are having to sue their unions because of it. This second impact syndrome was really what has driven a fair bit of concussion as well, particularly in Northern Ireland, where a young fella died from it. And again, this is Alison Pollock was heavily involved in this. And this is where even a fairly innocuous head injury to begin with, folk return, go on, carry on playing, and then they get another head injury. And we're not terribly certain of what happens in that, but it seems to affect the brain circulation. And there seems to be a sudden expansion in that, and a sudden expansion in the brain, and that causes death. So, and it's sad because it happens in youngsters, it happens in children and adolescents. It is rare, and in fact, at one time, again, by this guy in the States, it was dismissed, but it's not any longer. Now, to get back to play, you have to be free of symptoms at rest. Yeah, most episodes resolve in 7 to 10 days. That's not that common. Longer recovery in children and adolescents, basically because what I've said, but also because the young brain is still still growing in terms of its electricity and wiring, effectively. I get tested, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I get tested, and and then also they start doing some training. And if the training causes symptoms, i.e. headache or nausea or reduction in their testing, they go back a step. But to do that, you have actually to get a baseline testing. And this thing, which is the standard concussion assessment tool, and a Cogstate, are kind of paperwork and computer work stuff that players sit and assess. And they're basically little tests, little mathematical tests, little English tests, little psychometric tests, little psychological tests. And they score that at the start of the season. Once they have an injury, they're assessed against that. And that is why, they go off and they do this Cogstate particularly, they assess that. If they score lower than what they've got, that's them, they're off the pitch. There was an issue some years ago that guys found how to get around them, but I think they've changed the questions. Instead of keeping the questions the same each time, they've actually started to change the questions. This is the Sport Concussion Assessment Tool. Up to 5 now, and the sort of things, Glasgow. This is the acute. Glasgow Coma scale is where people who have had a head injury, presumably usually in a road traffic accident, but it says if you've been knocked out. And this Maddox score, which is what you would use on the pitch to see if they need a head injury, is 5 questions. What venue are we at? Which half is it? Who scored last? What team did you play last week? Did your team win the last game? It can remember those things. And one of the things that because it's short-term memory loss, like dementia that you're getting. One of the things to ask is, who are you sitting beside in the team bus? That's quite helpful too. So they get scored not at the beginning of the season on that, but they get scored at the beginning of the season on some of the other stuff. And of course, that gets put on computer and they get tested. You can see you get tested with other things. I'm not sure about the Rubik's Cube, whether they get tested with that. This is the thing we're talking about. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this is basically recurrent subconcussive or concussive episodes. You know, you think of Muhammad Ali, you think of other people that had obviously had it. And these studies show that there's this tau protein deposition, and that's the stuff that gets laid down in dementia, in Alzheimer's. And it stops the function of the brain. It stops the messages being sent. And we're now, and part of it become important because of this guy, Steve Thompson, and deliberate error. I think he's got a P in his name. And this is the English hooker during the early 2000s, who was a hard man on the pitch, I think it's fair to say, and led with his head. And sadly, he's bearing the brunt of several concussive episodes. But again, I think what we're seeing from there is that the evidence at the time meant that we dealt with it as we thought we were dealing with it well at the time. And we probably know that now, but it wasn't. Recognise, remove, refer, rest, recover, return. Recover, very important. If in doubt, sit them out. Now, when I was touring, I met some very nice people, as you can see. That's George Graham. I don't know who he is, but when I was touring a part of it, I always like to return to Linlithgow, make sure I was back for the marches. And again, we won't be seeing those this year. And I think I've said enough.
Ken, I can just remember in my day of playing that if somebody got a bad head knock, sometimes they used to whip out the smelling salts. Did that do anything?
No, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Other than Burnley and City your nose, because they were quite caustic, so it was quite nasty. No, there was a lot of myths about concussion, and it goes around. You know, I go back to Tom Young's kind of the thump, this Mako image. In fact, the guy who's the chair of the Rugby Football Union in England said we need to change the language we use in rugby. You know, we're talking about big hits. Oh, that's a big hit. That's a great hit. You know, a big hit causes concussion because all you do is just rattle your head back and forward. You get what's called. It's called a contra coup injury. It's just bang, bang, bang.
Yeah.
No, they didn't do it. I mean, there's the old joke about the rugby league player who was a young rugby league player who was having a stormer of a game, and he was sidestepping and running through, but still didn't score. And eventually one time he ran through, sidestep, and ran straight into the posts, and the trainer came on and got the wet sponge out and stuffed it down the front of his shorts. And he says, "That's not where it hurts." He says, "No, lad, that's where our brains are."
Basically, I'm interested in the way you think the game will develop from where we are just now, and to keep youngsters encouraged in the game. I'm not too au fait with the way that youngsters are introduced to the game, although I know there's no touch rugby or something like that. But what sort of overall message is SFA sending out to local clubs, local organisations about promoting rugby and their safety programme?
You probably have to ask somebody at the rugby club that way about that, but certainly, it's the tackle. The tackle is a very important thing, and the tackle is, it's all about technique. It's all about making it safe. And you're right. I mean, they start off playing no contact. Contact doesn't become a big issue until later on, and it's all about enjoyment. It's all about skills. And I think that's what the message is going out is. skills development, physical development, and then increase the amount of contact. For instance, years ago, the SRU, by the way, not the SFA, altered the scrummage rules for underage kids. You know, in an international game, you see them scrummaging and trying to move everybody. In underage, you can only move half a metre, I think it is. And then the scrum's grown up. So it's changing the laws, changing the safety for safety reasons, and these are the sort of things that I think it will go ahead. Looking at it another way, and if you go back to what Rona Nagara said about that, you're now looking for an athlete and trying to make them into a rugby player. I think that's the wrong. That personally, to me, and I think the SRU are beginning to realise that. And because we're getting guys like Darcy Graham coming through now, find a rugby player, and then you can turn them into, you can train them up, and to get fit and safe, and that's the issue, you know, and safe. So you have to be safe to do it. So you have to be conditioned to do rugby.
I'm an American football player, so I, have no idea about this. Are there statistics to compare international rugby injuries with club rugby injuries? Because I think there's a huge difference between the way in which club rugby is necessarily played and the injuries that can occur there and to carry on playing, as opposed to the international sort of injuries.
The SRU keeps these stats. After every injury, you had to fill out a form, and it goes to the SRU. I wouldn't have any up-to-date stats because I've been out of the game for quite a while. But what I would say is that when I was team doctor and I was at Linlithgow for quite a while, I mean, you got an injury in the amateur game probably every couple of games. Now you're getting 2 injuries every game in the professional sport because of the size of them, the hits. I don't know if you've been at a professional game recently and stood close to the touchline, but you need ear defenders on. It's actually interesting. American football. American football was one of the areas that altered the laws to make it safer, and that was with their helmets, because they used to come further down the neck, and because of that, when they would get tackled, they were getting a lot of quadriplegics. So they changed it, but I think they're now getting a lot of concussive episodes, and things like helmets do not make any difference. And in fact, in some ways, a helmet in American football, and I just let's talk about this, might actually be making it worse.
Well, the idea of the helmet is a part of the sort of tackling mechanism.
Correct.
And it's really, I mean, in training, it was interesting, a statistic in training, because when we were playing in training, we were virtually naked and a helmet on.
Yeah.
And we just ran around like headless chickens, and you got injured that way.
And
when you came to the game, you were absolutely locked into everything. So.
Yeah. And actually, there's a similar statistic that said that, again, about 15 to 20% of injuries in America was due to the body armor and the helmet.
Yeah.
So you're right.
So I take it from that you wouldn't recommend even more padding than they are actually already wearing at the senior level in rugby, because that may well be counterproductive. Did I hear that right?
Correct. I mean, there's no evidence even that. I mean, gum shields were introduced to stop concussion, but but what they do stop is folk getting their teeth smashed up. Helmets, these ridiculous things that they wear. There's certainly no evidence that they reduce concussion. They reduce cuts, and I think there's little doubt about that. Shoulder padding that was used for years didn't reduce the incidence of shoulder. Folk got this false sense of security, and they'd go thumping into rucks and tackles and hoping that their body armor was going to protect them. No way.
I'd just like to thank on your behalf, Ken, for that was very interesting and very entertaining and slightly scary because most of us played sport. Those that did play sport, and I think that probably is most of us, played sport in the days when nobody cared about stuff like that. And unless you actually had a broken bit, you stayed on the field. Actually, quite often, even if you did have a broken bit, I think I played one half with a fractured collarbone. Mind you, I was put way out on the wing, and didn't really do anything for the rest of the game. But those days, I think, are well gone now. Anyway, thank you, because I suspect it's partly thanks to people like you that they are well gone. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much for a very interesting and entertaining talk today. Thank you. And if you'll all unmute, we can clap.
Well, again, thanks very much, Ken. Our next meeting in 2 weeks' time is going to be Donald Ford. I think many of you know Donald Ford, a man who's reinvented himself on several occasions as an accountant, as a photographer. I believe he was once a football player. Big cricket. I've got a cricket match with him. He's owned a display company, so that should be quite an interesting talk. So that's in 2 weeks' time. We've got Donald Ford. Thanks again to you, Ken. The recording should be up tomorrow. Silly me, I didn't record the banter before the meeting, so there'll just be one recording, which is of the meeting, and I'll put the question and answer bit on the end of it. So that should be up tomorrow. So thanks again, and goodbye, everybody. See you in a couple of weeks' time.